Okay, so the last section in this chapter is about conservation biology. So we've talked about what is biodiversity, why is it important, and how we're losing it to extinction because of human impacts. So this chapter is what we're doing as humans now to conserve the biodiversity that still exists. So by definition, conservation biology is a study that seeks to understand the loss, protection, and restoration of biological diversity. And this arose as biologists became alarmed at how fast we were losing species and degrading the natural systems because of our human activities. So we are looking to solve the problems of habitat degradation and species loss as we move through conservation biology. So some forms this might take would be sampling insects in Madagascar, drawing blood from a Seychelles magpie robin, or checking camera traps in Africa. So conservation biology is in response to biodiversity loss, so we're not really looking to change things away from the way they were naturally. We're not looking to increase species more than were found before human impact. We're looking to return things to a state from before human impact. And so scientists do this by combining ecology and evolution, so looking at the way living things interact and the way things change over time, as they use field data, so data they gather from doing observations in the wild, lab data, what can they gather from doing experiments in a laboratory setting. A lot of this cannot be studied in a lab because that would undo the purpose of studying it in its natural habitat, right? And we're going to study our impacts on other organisms as well as respond to these impacts. And genetic or conservation biology will look from the basic level of genetic diversity, which we talked about. There's 3 levels: genetic diversity, species diversity, and ecosystem diversity. So they work on all 3 levels. On the genetic level, they would study genetic attributes of organisms to infer the status of their population. So we're looking at the actual DNA to be able to understand things about their populations. If 2 populations are different, they may have different ecological needs, which would lead to needing different types of management. So these may not be things we could tell from the surface of just observing them. So by looking at their DNA, we get a deeper understanding. And as a population shrinks, we're going to lose genetic diversity, and that's important. So conservation geneticists would determine how small a population can become before it becomes dangerous, and how much genetic variation it can lose before it encounters inbreeding depression, which we already talked about. And remember that inbreeding depression is when there's so little genetic variation, so all the organisms are so similar to each other that parents are producing weak or defective offspring. It's why humans don't marry brothers and sisters because of this. But that can happen in nature if there's if there's not enough diversity but amongst a species. So you may mate with an organism or with another member of your species that you're not related to, but there's so little genetic diversity that would have the same outcome as if you were mating with someone that you are related to. And so by determining the size that is like the threshold of being okay, they can help wildlife managers make plans for increasing the size of a population. And small and isolated populations are often the most vulnerable. And we've talked about that in a lot of ways, right? Island populations with endemic species are the most likely to be wiped out. And so we really need to pay attention to that. So these geneticists are studying how organisms disperse from one habitat patch to another, and how their genes flow among subpopulations to learn about how likely a population is to persist or succumb in the face of environmental change. So let's say that, let's talk about climate change. Let's say temperatures keep warming. How likely is that species to be able to survive because it can move to another place where it can live, or there's enough gene flow happening so that we're not losing genetic diversity. Gene flow is when individuals of 2 different communities, 2 different populations, are still mating, so we're maintaining that genetic diversity so that we're not all becoming related. So the endangered species are a focus of conservation efforts. I'm sure you've heard about endangered species your whole life. It's a big thing that's very topical. So the Endangered Species Act was created in 1973, and it offers protection to species that fall within 2 categories. The first is endangered, which it means that they are in danger of becoming extinct in the near future, or threatened, which means that they are likely to become endangered soon. So neither of these are good. Endangered is worse. And it forbids the U.S. government and citizens from taking actions that destroy individuals within identified species. So basically, you can't do anything that would kill or negatively affect anything that's endangered or threatened. And it also prevents trade of products made from endangered or threatened species to hopefully prevent these extinctions and enable the declining populations to recover. So we'll talk, we can talk about elephants and their tusks. So elephants are killed because their tusks are ivory, which is a fine, people like to make things out of ivory. And so that is illegal because we don't want these organisms to be killed because they're being hunted. And so as of 2016, 1,229 species were listed as endangered and 367 were listed as threatened. And 75% of these species have government agencies running recovery plans to protect them or increase their population. So 3/4 of them, the government is actively working to protect them and increase their population. So we're not just trying to protect them, we are trying to increase their population so that they move off the list. So that's the goal. The ESA has had several successes, one of them being the recovery of the bald eagle, the peregrine falcon, the brown pelican, and other birds following the ban of DDT in 1973. So these guys are no longer listed as endangered. DDT is a chemical that was used in pesticides, which is super harmful, especially as it moves up the food chain. So it's not as harmful to the mice, but as it moves up, because the eagle eats so many mice, it gets a lot more of the toxin inside, and then it dies. So their numbers were super low. At one point, there were only, nope, that's a different bird. But their numbers were super low, and DDT was banned, and 40% of the declining population, so they were able to save these types of birds. Overall, 40% of declining populations of these species that are on the list have been stabilized. So that's pretty good. Almost half of them, their populations have been stabilized. Maybe not increased, maybe they're not growing, but we've at least saved what is there. And for every species that has gone extinct in the time since 1973, 3 have recovered enough that they've been removed from the endangered list. So it is doing positive things. However, the federal authorization for spending under the ESA expired in 1992. So there was funding written into the law, and it expired in 92, and it has not been reauthorized since then. So as a result, a number of species judged in need of protection have not been added to the law. So basically, Congress still awards money or okays money in its budget for the ESA every year, but it's not automatic like it was for the first 20 years of the act. But what happens is now any new species that wants to get on the list, or several new species if a new species wants to get on the list, what could happen is it would be deemed warranted, not protected. Warranted but precluded, meaning that its place on the list is warranted given research. It's earned a place on the list because of its numbers and what's happening to it, but it's precluded or prevented from getting on the list because of a lack of funding. And so a common perception of the law is that it imperils the livelihoods of some, such as the loggers in the Pacific Northwest that have reduced timber harvesting due to the endangered northern spotted owl and marbled murrelet. So a lot of people see the ESA as a threat to human livelihood because it affects their industry. So loggers in the Pacific Northwest have been affected by, they can't cut down as many trees because they're looking to protect these bird species. And then a lot of landowners also fear that the government will restrict the use of their own private land on which threatened or endangered species are found. So let's say that you have a lot of land and there's an endangered species living on it. A lot of landowners would not want to be restricted about what they could do on their land. So what your book talks about is a trend of what they call shoot, shovel, and shut up. So basically, they would kill the individual, bury it, and not talk about it to prevent the government from finding out that it lives on their land. So those are some downsides to the ESA. And so the ESA can't always stop development projects, but what it also is trying to do is cooperate with landowners. So it is working to find a compromise. And there's a few things that it's doing. One of them is called a habitat conservation plan. which allows the landowner to harm some individuals of a species if the overall habitat is improved. So if the landowner is working to improve the habitat and a few of individuals are lost as a casualty, that's okay as long as overall they're improving the habitat. And a safe harbor agreement is a promise that the government will not pursue additional action if the landowner pursues actions that assist in the species recovery. So basically, you can, you're not going to get in trouble if you work towards things that will help the species recover. One particular contentious situation that happened was between the federal officials, so the people that put the ESA into play, and the cattle ranchers as well as oil and gas drillers over the potential listing of the greater sage grouse as endangered. So this pretty guy right here is the greater sage grouse, and so he needs to be listed as endangered based on the research, but the cattle ranchers and the oil and gas drillers have a problem. Right now he's warranted but not precluded, and that's because they don't want him listed because restrictions would complicate their industries. So basically they would then have restrictions placed on them on where they could cattle ranch or where they could drill if this guy was protected. So they waged a campaign to lessen impacts on the grouse populations, which federal officials deemed adequate to conserve the species. So basically they didn't put him on the list because then these industries would not be able to continue, but what they did was come up with an agreement of them which would lessen the impacts on them. So they're still protecting them even though there's some what's the word? There's some problems with working with the industries around. And in 2015, the bird was denied listing on the endangered species list. The government said that the government had said that this agreement was enough to protect it, but both sides are kind of upset with it. The industries say that they're being asked too much of, and the environmentalists say that not enough is being done for the bird. So even though it might seem like a happy medium, neither side is happy. So that's what happens in the U.S., the ESA, but then there's also international things that are working for conservation. So, and these are treaties that were facilitated by the UN, the United Nations. So in 1973, same year as the ESA, the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora, which is called CITES, bans the international transport of the body of parts of rare species. So we talked about this briefly about the elephant tusks, so kind of the same thing. So the international transport of body parts of rare species is not allowed. They had, their 1990 ban on ivory was their biggest accomplishment so far. Then there's the Convention on Biological Diversity, which was a treaty that provided funding and incentives for conservation in developing countries. So it's giving money to developing countries to help protect their wildlife and increase their biodiversity. So there were some successes, including promoting ecotourism at the Serengeti National Park, promoting sustainable crops like shade-grown coffee, and discouraging the use of pesticide investment or intensive farming. So some things that we're doing to, those are all to protect what's still there. Some things we're doing to improve what's there is captive breeding, reintroduction, and cloning. Captive breeding is where we raise wildlife in our zoos or in our wildlife preserves to eventually hopefully reintroduce them, because we can have as many individuals in captivity as we need, but it's not returning things to how they were if they only ever live in captivity. So your book talks about how in 2010 32 black rhinos were reintroduced into a national park in the Serengeti to restore a former population. 65 plant and animal species now exist only in captivity, so what we want to be able to do is return them to where they are found. California condors is a success story. So by 1982, there were only 22 California condors left. They were being killed because they were being shot down, and they are scavengers, so they eat dead animals. So any dead animals that were shot with a lead bullet were then, when they eat them, then the condors were getting lead poisoning. So since then, captive breeding programs have released 268 condors into the wild, and there's 167 still in captivity. The problem is that the reasons that they were dying still exist, so we need to work on banning the lead shooting, and it's happening in California as of this year.